My guest at this time is Daniel Kochis. He is a policy analyst at the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. We've asked him to comment on the political turmoil in Great Britain, where Prime Minister Theresa May is unable to get a Brexit deal through Parliament, but keeps surviving votes of no confidence. So where is all of this headed, and what should be the U.S. position as this keeps playing out? And Daniel, thank you very much for being with us.
A pleasure to be on today. Thank you for having me.
Well, a lot of different elements here. Let's start with this. Why can't a Brexit deal get through Parliament?
Well, a Brexit deal can't get through Parliament basically because there isn't support for it as it's currently substantiated by Theresa May. So within her own party, the Conservative Party, there's a huge split between those, I think, who see the deal as a repudiation of what the people voted for. Over 17 million Britons voted to leave the European Union, and they don't see this deal, as she put forward to them, as actually bringing about a removal of the United Kingdom from the European Union. Then you have another element within her party, I think, that believes that this deal does too much. And then, of course, you have the opposition parties like Labour, which voted overwhelmingly against her. So she really doesn't have a huge element of support for this deal. It went down in historic fashion, a margin of 230 votes separating those for and against.
So who's right among the factions of the Conservative Party? Does it not do enough? Does it go too far?
Well, in my opinion, it doesn't do enough. I think that the British people voted to leave the European Union. They voted to take control of sovereignty, meaning sovereignty over their judicial decisions, also over their own laws, over their borders. And I don't think that this withdrawal agreement did enough. Really, it sort of kept the United Kingdom in this de facto limbo, perpetual limbo, where they were going to have to abide by the same sort of regulations and rules emanating from the EU, but they would have lost their seat at the table to vote on those and to help shape them. And they didn't have any ability to get out of this, what we call on the economic side, the customs union. And so the only way they could have gotten out was if the EU had agreed to basically let them go. And so I think that, many members of the British public and of Theresa May's own party saw this for what it was, and it was, sort of a soft way to keep the UK within the European Union, and they rejected that as not something that the British people voted for.
We're talking with Daniel Kochis of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation in Washington. And we know that come March 29th that there's not a deal. Britain leaves anyway. And from what I can tell, the folks who generally agree with your assessment of the Brexit deal that Theresa May was pushing think that's the best case scenario. And I know Labour, led by Jeremy Corbyn, is throwing fits over that possibility and trying to make sure that Theresa May refuses to do that. So is that the best case scenario here from your perspective? And how do you expect it to actually work out here in the next 2.5 months?
It certainly wasn't the ideal situation, I think, to leave without a deal, but I think is in the current political environment in the United Kingdom, I think this is probably the best that we can hope for now is for the United Kingdom to leave without a deal. They would trade, for instance, with other countries on World Trade Organization terms. It would also free them up to, say, look into negotiating a U.S.-UK free trade agreement. I think this is something that actually they could gain quite a bit of support in Congress from both Republicans and Democrats in the United States. But, I think there really are three sort of pathways for the UK right now. I think there's the no-deal Brexit, which I think is probably the best one under the current circumstances. There's also, I think, the possibility that they leave with a deal. And so that's, if Theresa May were to be able to gain some sort of new concessions from the EU or something that she could claim as a concession from the EU, she probably will likely bring this deal once again back to Parliament to vote on. If it were to pass, then you would have a deal. And then the third option is one where somehow you would have an extension of the deadline. So right now, as you mentioned, the deadline is March 29th for the UK is going to be leaving if nothing else happens. But she could opt to try to somehow extend that deadline for another few months to buy her some additional negotiating time. But I think at this point, the most likely situation is for no-deal Brexit, but certainly a very fluid situation overseas.
I don't know how practical or feasible this is, but from what I'm reading, there's some folks who really want a fourth option, and that's a revote, a new referendum, and basically in the hopes that the people will have a different verdict this time.
Yeah, it's truly incredible. There is an element within the UK and indeed within the EU that would like to see sort of a second referendum. The Prime Minister has so far expressly sort of squashed that as an option for her. I think that that's an extremely unlikely option. And you think about sort of the political backlash. I mean, this would be sort of like having a presidential election in the United States. Your candidate lost, and therefore you just kept arguing that you wanted a new vote. And I'm not even convinced if they were to vote again that the Remain side would win. I think the Leave actually could win with even greater numbers. But this is very typical of the EU, and we've seen it over its history with a host of different treaties that they've put forward to populations within Europe and France and Denmark and the Netherlands, where they've rejected said treaty, which would give the central government in Brussels more power. And what they've done is they've just resubmitted the treaty again, usually under a different name and sort of under a different guise, until they get the result that they want. And, I think about if there was an announcement that there would be a second referendum in the UK, I think that you would have such a tremendous backlash because it's just a complete repudiation of what the people voted for. And how would you know that they would actually stick to the results of the second one? I get very frustrated, I think, when I see signs, oftentimes that say, we need a people's vote, which for people that hold those signs means we need a second referendum. But there already was a people's vote in 2016, and the people voted to leave the European Union.
Well, before we get into the politics of Theresa May and her survival mode here, let's briefly tie up the Brexit issue with the best way for the Trump administration and the U.S. in general to approach this. You mentioned there could be a very lucrative U.S.-UK trade agreement if, in fact, Brexit happens without a deal come March 29th. What's the best way for the U.S. to position itself as well as possible for that?
So certainly, the UK cannot officially negotiate any sort of trade agreement until they're outside of the auspices of the EU. But there have been, I think, some sort of, off the record, talks between officials in the U.S. and the UK about what, the parameters of such an agreement would be. One of my colleagues actually worked on with think tanks in the UK and the US about sort of what an ideal free trade agreement would look like and put out a paper on that. And so I think for the United States, they need to recognize that, it's in our interest to have a United Kingdom that is sovereign, that can dictate its own trade policy, that can dictate its own border policy, not allowing itself, to take in hundreds of thousands of people, sort of against the will of their own citizens, that would allow them, I think, to continue to be such a strong defense partner for the United States. You think about the UK is, for instance, one of the key intelligence allies the United States has. There is some concern that were they to stay in the European Union, that could be damaged because of some of the structures that they might be pushed into. So I think for the United States, I think continued support for, an optimistic vision of what the UK can be post the EU, I think is something I think the President has mentioned, of course, that, the UK cannot enter into a free trade agreement if they were to stay within the customs union. That's a very important point. And I think, it's interesting that the Trump administration has, of course, a skepticism that we haven't seen from previous presidents. And I think it's warranted about whether or not deeper European integration is really in the interest of the United States. And so I think continuing to sort of explore that vein is actually also very helpful.
All right, in our last minute or two here, let's talk about Theresa May and the number of lives she has here politically. David Cameron, of course, is the previous prime minister, and he resigned shortly after failing to win the campaign against Brexit. But how does Theresa May keep surviving these no-confidence votes when she keeps losing on these big Brexit votes?
That's right. She does have seemingly a knack for survival. The most recent vote that she survived was because her coalition partners, which have really kept the Conservatives in power, which is a Northern Irish party, the DUP, voted for her to keep her within government. Of course, she also survived basically a coup attempt within her own party at the end of December when the Conservatives attempted to oust her unsuccessfully. I think that largely can be attributed to people within the Conservative Party being very afraid of a new election. I don't think anyone wants a new election on the Conservative side because they're very afraid of a prime ministership of Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader. And so I think in their view, a premiership of Theresa May, while not ideal, is better than the potential alternative. So they're going to sort of stick with her at least through the March 29th transition period. After that, it's open season, and we'll sort of see what happens. And it's such a changing situation. I think depending on which of the tracks she sort of takes now after having lost the vote, you could see different elements, voting, in different ways, and I think future no confidence votes. And I do anticipate that there'll probably be another few in the next couple months put forward by Labour, and you could see sort of shifting allegiances even within the Conservative Party on how they vote, depending on sort of the track that she's taking as we get closer to that deadline.
And just to clarify on how the system works there, if the Tories decided we've got this other person we'd prefer to be the prime minister, and then our coalition's okay with it, can they just swap someone in there, or do they have to have new elections?
So in theory, yes, they could swap somebody out. The issue is that they tried to depose her under this system at the end of December, and the way that the rules are written, they cannot do that again until for a whole another year. So she's basically safe from sort of a Conservative Party removal for another year, but she isn't safe from sort of a vote of no confidence that's called by an opposition party. And that could pass, of course, with Conservative votes potentially. So, within her own party being replaced, she's safe at least until next December. But I think in terms of the broader picture of Parliament, she's not necessarily safe. And so we'll see how that plays out, I think, in the weeks and months ahead.
So people voting because they really, really don't want the other one. That sounds pretty familiar.
Yes. I think that's a lot of what is going on overseas.
Absolutely. Daniel, thank you so much for your time today. Very interesting.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.
Daniel Kochis, policy analyst at the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.